Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Tom Standage. Tom is a journalist, author, and editorial executive currently serving as the deputy editor of The Economist. Tom is the author of 6 books, and today we will speak about his latest book, A Brief History of Motion, From the Wheel to the Car to What Comes Next. Tom, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, Tom, I have to tell you, The Economist is among my top 3 publications that I read practically every day. It's the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and The Economist. So I'm just so delighted to speak to someone who works there. Can I ask you, how is it that you got into journalism?
It was sort of an accident. So I went to university in the late 1980s, and I was one of the kids who got home computers in the 1980s for the first time, and so I was really into programming, and that was what I wanted to do. And I'd also read a lot of science fiction, so I wanted to build robots and AIs. That's what I wanted to do. And when I got to university, I discovered that the robotics was quite interesting, but I discovered that AI really wasn't working, and it was sort of the end. It was the late 80s. It was the end of the sort of the fifth generation AI boom, and we were just about to go into an AI winter. So that clearly wasn't going to work. But while I was at university, I started using the internet, and I did think it was a bit strange that you could send emails to people all around the world and you didn't have to pay for it, and so on. And by the time I left university, the internet boom was just getting started, and so I did a little bit of photography and a little bit of freelance journalism. But what ended up happening was that the newspapers in Britain didn't have anyone who knew about the internet, and I started pitching stories to the Guardian in particular. About the internet and internet culture and all of the things that were happening. And I ended up going and working at the Guardian for a year. And then I went from there to the Daily Telegraph, and then I went from there to the Economist. And the reason I went to the Economist, well, I'd read the Economist since I was a teenager, and I'd always wanted to work there. But also the internet boom, I was worried that being someone who just wrote about the internet was a sort of precarious position to be in the it's sort of mid to late 90s, because newspapers were hiring lots of people to write about it because they could get a lot of advertising from the companies that were selling modems and things like that. And it wasn't clear how long that boom was going to last. A lot of newspapers had internet supplements and things like that. And I'd done engineering as my degree at university. In those days, you couldn't study computing at Oxford, so I did it as part of an engineering degree, and that meant I had a broad grounding in the physical sciences generally. So it was a sort of switch for me to go to The Economist and become a science correspondent and write about the insides of microchips and space probes and all of those sorts of things, which I was also very interested in, and not just write about the internet. Inevitably, I did end up having to write about the internet and technology and business and other things. And essentially, though, my career in journalism is, it happened because of a happy accident. The internet was my ticket into this field, and I'm just sort of, people say life is lived forward but understood backwards. The thing I've always been interested in is, what does the future look like? And that's why I like sci-fi. It's why I'm interested in history, because I think, it's worth looking at patterns in history. But it's also why being a journalist, and particularly a tech journalist, is very exciting, because you get to see the future as it's being created, and you get to talk to the people who are creating it. I met people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk before most people had heard of them at all. And ages and ages and ages ago, and it's been extraordinary to see, the influence that people like that now have, because this is the triumph of the geeks, right? The engineers and the geeks and the people who understand computers have sort of taken over the world, and in a very small way, I've been carried along by that tide.
Just one question. So you started your career as a journalist and by pitching articles to The Guardian, but
Yes.
it's not easy to all of a sudden develop journalistic skills good enough to submit an article to The Guardian. And, were you self-taught, or do you have a coach, or how were you able to submit? I mean, even now, after blogging for so many years, I feel so much apprehension to submit an article to my local newspaper here.
Right. I had done a bit of journalism at university. I'd actually been mostly a photographer at university, so I worked on the student papers, but as a photographer. But then a couple of times, the journalist I was with, wouldn't show up, and I would end up writing the story as well. Um, but most of the people I was working on with the at the student paper were people who were studying English and things like that. So I didn't think that I should be writing either. I thought that was a bit strange. But when it comes to technical subjects, I think it's slightly different because I'd done a bit of writing for the British Journal of Photography. I'd done a bit of writing for Mac User. So that was sort of technical trade journalism first. And that sort of thing, I think the barriers to getting into that, you have to know what you're talking about, and you have to be able to string a sentence together. But that means that when I was pitching to the Guardian, in particular to the computer pages, that meant that I could say I've already written for Mac User, and they would sort of say, "Well, you probably know what you're doing," and they would take a piece from me and see what it was like. So that was the thing. So there was you do have to going straight in and pitching to a national newspaper. There are people who can do it, but you need to maybe you have to have some sort of track record, I think, most of the time to show people that they should commission a piece from you. I have to say that when I've been an editor at The Economist, um, I've been very open to if somebody pitches me a piece and they sound like they know what they're talking about, and ideally, I mean, very often when I've been editing the tech pages, people will say, "Would you like a piece on this?" And I'll say, "That sounds very interesting," and I can sort of get a sense just from emailing them or talking to them on the phone whether they sound like they know what they're doing. And then if the piece is a complete disaster, then you can spike it and not use it. But I think the barriers to entry are lower than people think they are, as long as you can make a convincing case that you understand the subject, as long as you have an angle that people understand. And I think understanding what publications are looking for is a big part of it. I do get pitched by people who think that because they work in an industry, they should be allowed to write about it, and it hasn't occurred to them that there's a conflict of interest. I often get pitched by people who say they work in content marketing or something like that. They're basically being paid by brands, and again, that disqualifies you instantly from doing journalism. Journalism has got to be writing about things in a way that you're trying to be as accurate as possible, and you don't have an agenda where you're being paid by somebody to push something forward. And so I think it's really a matter of understanding what publications are looking for, both in an editorial sense, story wise, where are they coming from, what sorts of stories do they like, and also understanding kind of what the basic ground rules are for doing journalism.
As I look at your work, I see that most of the books that you have been written are about history of
Yeah.
this and the other one. Can you mention some of the titles of the books that you have written?
Sure. So my first book was called The Victorian Internet, and it was the idea that the Victorians had an internet in the 19th century. And the reason I wrote that book was I was at the Daily Telegraph at the time, which is another British newspaper, and the Telegraph was named after the hot technology of the day, the electric telegraph, when it was founded in the mid 19th century. And I was working on the technology desk, and we were doing, a lot of coverage about the internet boom that was happening at the time. And I thought it would be amusing to write an article about the technology that had given the newspaper its name and contrast it with the internet. And what I was expecting was that the story of the Telegraph would be, it would be very primitive compared to the internet, and the internet was wonderful and let you do, pictures and send stuff around the world. But I went and looked at the history of the Telegraph and was amazed to discover that all of the things that were happening on the internet at the time had previously happened on the Telegraph. Things like cyber attacks, network attacks, cybercrime, online weddings, online romances, complaints about the pace of business life increasing and information overload, new business models. All of these things had happened with the Telegraph, and of course they had, because the Telegraph was this massive revolution in communications, that suddenly you could send information down a wire instead of having to send a letter. And so, it's not surprising in retrospect that actually you get a lot of the same phenomena. Anyway, so I wrote a feature article about that for the Telegraph, and then I pitched it as a book, and I ended up writing that book. And that sort of set my trajectory for the kinds of books that I write. I find it's very interesting to researched the history of science and technology, and I've looked at things like food and drink as though they are technologies, and written books about those too. And what I really try to do is find these big patterns in history and ask, what does that tell us about the present? How can that help us understand the present and understand the past? But also, what does it tell us about the future? So it sort of fits in. I think reading sci-fi, writing history, and doing journalism are sort of three different ways of coming at the same question, which is, what does the future look like?
Right. And then how do you stumble upon the topic of this book, History of Motion?
So this book, A Brief History of Motion, is essentially a book about cars, and sort of how cars changed the world, but also how we can't really understand how much cars changed the world, because everybody alive today has grown up in a world that has been dominated by cars. And so I wanted to kind of point out just how strange some of the things that we're used to really are. The idea that, roads belong to cars. And if you stand in a road, then it's your fault if someone crashes into you. And it's your duty not to be there. I mean, this is an idea that was sort of invented in the 1920s by the car industry, that there's something called road safety, and that road safety is about essentially pedestrians getting out of the way. And if they don't get out of the way, then it's because they haven't had enough training in road safety and they need more of it. And this is, of course, because people want to drive their cars really fast, and the car industry wants to sell lots of cars. And so they came up with this very effective campaign, and they pretended that it was all about in the name of safety, but it was actually in the name of allowing people to drive fast and selling more cars. So this is just one of the examples. And then, why does red mean stop and green mean go? Why do some countries drive on the left and some on the right? Why is it that, I mean, cars have led to things like supermarkets, fast food, shopping malls. These things wouldn't exist if we didn't have cars, or at least not in the way that we have them now. So I wanted to sort of trace all of those choices or accidents that led to all of this. And so to do that, I actually go back to right back to the invention of the wheel. So it's a sort of 5,000-year road trip. But most of it is focusing on what happened with the car in particular in the 20th century. And the reason I think it's relevant today is that we are at a sort of turning point, or a fork in the road, if you like, now, which is that we recognize that the way that urban transport is very dependent on cars today is unsustainable, and we probably need to be looking at alternatives. And we're starting to see quite an interesting set of alternatives to using cars and owning cars. And this is exactly the situation that big cities were in the 1890s. It was clear that the dominant form of urban transport, which was horse-drawn vehicles, was not sustainable. The horse population was growing faster than the human population. Enormous amounts of space were required for the stables. Enormous amounts of farmland was required to feed all the horses, and they were producing enormous amounts of horse manure that was causing this kind of health and pollution problem in the streets. And it was just getting worse and worse, and it was hard to see what the way out of this was. And of course, in retrospect, we know the car came along and people said, oh, like, let's do that instead, and that will solve all of our problems. And in fact, what the car did was it solved those problems related to horses, but it created a whole load of new ones. And so that's a sort of cautionary tale that if we're looking at alternatives to the car now, we need to avoid some of those, making those same mistakes. And so I think learning from history can be very useful as we contemplate the future of urban transport.
In my everyday life today, I see this new battle forming up of electric vehicles versus gas vehicles, which I think electric will win out. But this is not the first time that we have this battle. So can you tell us a little bit about the early times when electric and gas powered vehicles were battling against each other?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this is one of the there turn out to be all of these extraordinary stories in the history of the car where things that we think are modern have happened before. So, for example, there was a craze in 1915 and 1916 for things called jitneys, which were sort of unofficial taxi cabs. It was a bit like Uber, and that all got shut down in America. But it was, for about 18 months, it was this huge thing. And there are lots of other examples of there was a big craze for biofuels. Should you power cars using ethanol made from plants rather than petrol? And there was a serious debate about that at the beginning of the 20th century. But yes, probably the most striking one is the battle between electric cars and gas-powered cars in the 1890s and early 1900s. There was a third entrant as well, which was the steam-powered car. And in the late 1890s in the United States, about 5,000 cars a year were being sold, and they were roughly equally divided between steam, electric, and gas powered. And in fact, in 1897, the best selling car in the United States was an electric car. Um, the steam cars didn't survive very long because in order to use a steam powered vehicle, you have to start the boiler like a couple of hours before you want to go out. So it's, not very convenient. And you probably need to have somebody who like looks after it all the time, a butler or somebody like that who would have looked after your horses before and now looks after your car. But what happened with the electric cars and the petrol cars, it was clear that that was the battle. And originally, electric cars were much more attractive because they were much more reliable. We know this now. Electric cars have far fewer moving parts. And early gas-powered cars were extremely unreliable. They were very dirty. You had to fix them all the time, so you would get covered in oil and grease. They produced, black soot and this sort of thing. Cars didn't have closed bodies in those days, so you were sitting outdoors and you'd probably get this stuff all over you. And you also had to hand crank them to start them. So for all of these reasons, electric cars were quite a lot more convenient. They were more reliable, they were cleaner, they were quieter. Um, However, they had this big problem, which is that when you go out in an electric car and your battery runs out, you're then stuck. And there weren't places that you could recharge them, and you wouldn't be able to find one. Now, even today, when we do have places where you can recharge electric cars, and you can find them using satellite positioning on your phone. But even so, people are reluctant to buy electric cars today because they worry that they won't be able to find a place to charge it if they go out on a long journey. And the thing about the gas-powered car was that you knew then and you know today that if you head out onto the roads, you'll be able to find gas. And so this was really why gas-powered cars won, because cars were being sold as adventure machines, and they were sort of exciting and manly. You had to fix them yourself and all sort of thing. And electric cars ended up being positioned as women's cars because you didn't have to fix them, and it was assumed that women knew nothing about mechanics. You didn't have to hand crank them, and it was assumed that women were not strong enough to do that. And also, um, they were very quiet. You wouldn't get stuff on your dress. And so electric cars ended up in a niche as cars for women. And ultimately, they didn't take off. There weren't enough of them. There weren't enough charging points. And they kind of got forgotten about. And it's only in the last 20 or 30 years that electric cars have come back. And in part, it's because obviously we're concerned about climate change, but it's also because the battery technology has made an enormous leap forward since the 1990s with the development of the lithium-ion battery. Actually, not for cars originally. It was mainly developed to put in consumer electronics devices like laptops and camcorders. But it turns out to be a very good technology for cars, and that's why electric cars make sense now in a way that they didn't a century ago.
Right. At one time, I was a car owner. I'm not a car owner anymore, but being the owner of a car, especially one of these luxurious car, was kind of like a status symbol. Now, personally, I feel disdain and maybe pity for people who are car owners. Like, I mean, I can just step out and call a driver, and he will be here in 2 minutes. So I feel like my life is so much simpler not being a car owner. And in the city where I live, Montreal, there are more cyclist lane, and there are even more pedestrian street close off to automobiles. So my question is, are we hitting peak car ownership? Is being a car owner going out of fashion nowadays?
Well, I think there is evidence for peak car, um, and I think you are living in the future. I think that's the direction that things are going in. Now, obviously, you and I live in large cities with good public transport systems, and governments that are prepared to do things like build cycle lanes. And so this doesn't apply to everybody. Lots of people I mean, actually, today most people in the world do live in cities, and even more people will live in cities by the mid-century. But clearly, if you live in the country, then public transport will not be an option most of the time, and you are going to need a car. However, I think the general trend is clear. Firstly, this idea that well, I think the main thing that's happening is that owning a car is becoming less and less convenient and more expensive because um, you have to deal with things like well, it's harder to find traffic, harder to find parking. You have things like congestion charging in many cities now. We have it here in London. You have to pay to park on the street outside your own house very often, and this is good. I mean, it's discouraging people. It's making people say, actually, do I really need to own a car? At the margin, some people are saying I don't need to. And at the same time, the alternatives to owning a car, just as car ownership is becoming more expensive and less convenient, the alternatives to owning a car are becoming more convenient. So it's easier to use public transport when you've got a smartphone that can tell you when the next bus or the next train is coming and how to put together two buses or two trains to get to where you want to go. It's easier to live without a car, without owning a car, if you can hail a ride through Uber or something like that. You can also rent bikes or scooters using your phone. And this is what I call the Internet of Motion, where all of these other alternatives to the car, which on their own are no substitute for the car, but if you put them all together, they're a much more compelling alternative to the car. And this is why I think we are seeing young people learning to drive later than they used to, or in some cases not learning to drive at all. And if you look at the average number of miles driven per person and per vehicle, they're going down in the developed world. So in the US, they peaked in 2004. In Western Europe, they peaked in the 1990s. Now, the overall number of miles driven across the whole country in the US is still going up, but it's going up more slowly than the population and the number of vehicles. So the number of miles driven per person or per vehicle is actually going down on average. And I think that is, for me, that is peak car. I think we are going to be less dependent on cars in the future. And now we have this whole situation at the moment where people are reluctant to go on public transport because of the pandemic, and that has meant that we've seen a surge in the price of secondhand cars and people driving when they would previously have taken public transport. But we're also seeing people working from home more and therefore not having to commute at all in some cases, or commuting fewer days a week. And I think that's a blip. I think the long-term trend, I think this blip in driving more will be short term, and I think the long term trend is away from the car and away from car ownership. That's not to say there won't be cars in the future and that nobody will own a car. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying more and more people are going to say, you know what, owning a car is a hassle, it's expensive, and it's just easier to use the other means of transport that I can get to through my phone. I don't have to go shopping to the supermarket if I can just order food, order my groceries, and they get brought to my door. I don't have to drive to the mall and buy something if I can order it on the internet. And all of these reasons for owning a car are much less compelling than they used to be.
I think owning a car in the future will be so much of a luxury as owning a horse today. You know,
Yes, I think
you
that's where I think that's where we're ending up. I think it will be a sort of hobbyist. I mean, horses haven't gone away, and there are people who enjoy riding them, but it is very much a hobby of the rich. And I think the same will be true of combustion engine cars in particular. I think people will still be racing Ferraris or whatever in the 2050s, but they'll be running on synthetic carbon neutral fuel. They won't be running on gas.
So the subtitle of your book, the last line is "To What Comes Next." And as I'm sitting here outside of I look outside of my window and I see a guy going on an electric skateboard, or other people going on electric bicycles, and I seen in the news what is it, drones and drones motorcycle. So what's the future of transportation of motion?
Well, I think the future is all of the above. So I think the big problem with horse-drawn traffic in cities was that we were very reliant on horses, and then in the 20th century we kind of became too reliant on the car. So we put all of our eggs in one basket in both of those cases, or nearly all of them. And I think the future of transport is a much more diverse mix of things. So a mixture of public transport, a mixture of things like scooters and ride hailing and bike rental, which are often provided by private companies. And yes, then we've got these new interesting forms of transport coming along. We don't know if they'll work, if they'll be safe, how widespread they'll be. But yes, things like electric drone taxis, so eVTOL aircraft. So they can sort of hop and skip from one part of a city to another, carrying a few passengers. Also, self-driving cars, autonomous cars, we may see those as well in some parts of the world. I think we'll probably see them in China first in large numbers. But the nice thing about this model of gluing together all of these different forms of transport using the smartphone is that it can be very, very flexible and very adaptable, and different cities can use different mixtures of transport modes. And when new modes become available, you can slot them into this model. So it doesn't sort of it's not as rigid as the whole car-based system where you had to have cars and you had to have parking and you had to have this whole infrastructure, roads and everything that was sort of built around cars. And every time you built a supermarket, you had to have a certain number of parking spaces. And every time you built an apartment block, you had to have a certain number of parking spaces. And all of the, we really bent the world out of shape around the car. And I think that is what we are now going to be unpicking, and we'll be using these other much more flexible means of transport. So I think that's the way we're going, from a sort of car monoculture to this much more diverse environment of different kinds of transport.
I have an idea that you didn't cover in your book, which is walking. I mean, we are suffering from
Yes, no,
an
absolutely. That's
obesity
true. Yeah. It's
epidemic.
extraordinary. No, I think you're right, because about half of all car journeys are less than 3 miles, I think. And in America, it's even higher than that. And in a lot of cases, it's because there aren't sidewalks. If you're in LA or you're in a suburb, a gated community or something, there may actually not be a way to walk to the shops. And I think that is a problem. But yes, people talk about active transport, by which they mean either walking or cycling, where you're also doing exercise. And yes, I think you're absolutely right. We need to include that as well.
Perfect. Okay, Tom, this is amazing. Can you tell us one more time the title of the book and where can the listeners follow your work?
Sure. The book's called A Brief History of Motion: From the Wheel to the Car to What Comes Next. It's published by Bloomsbury, and you can find it in the usual places. And in particular, if you search for my name, Tom Standage, then you can find it. And yes, I mean my work at The Economist, we don't have bylines in The Economist, so it's hard to tell what I've written. But The Economist is at economist.com, and I have my own website at tomstandage.com. But actually, I haven't updated it lately, and I probably should.
Yes, you should. But I should also mention that you wrote a very nice article on The Guardian that also helped me a lot to prepare for this interview. I will put it in the show notes as well.
Great, thank you. That's actually an extract from the book, and it's a very good, it gives you a sense of the kinds of things that the book is about, but it's only a very, very small part of the story.
Right. Okay, Tom, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.